This is one of those things that sounds small, but it can completely change your life. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because of shouting or spectacle, but because two very different perspectives quietly collide in real time. That's what viewers witnessed during Johnny Depp's appearance on a daytime talk show that closely mirrors the format and tone of The View, when a discussion that began as a measured conversation about career, public scrutiny, and accountability gradually shifted into a noticeably tense exchange with Joy Behar. And before we get into how that unfolded, make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. When Johnny Depp walked onto the set that morning, the atmosphere in the studio was warm and welcoming, exactly what longtime viewers expect from a panel-driven daytime show. The hosts greeted him with applause, some standing briefly as he took his seat at the table. Depp appeared calm, dressed in his usual understated style, offering small smiles and nods to the audience as he settled in. From the start, the tone felt conversational rather than promotional. This wasn't framed as a big exclusive or a headline-grabbing interview. Instead, it was positioned as a chance to hear from him directly about where he was professionally and personally, particularly after a long period of intense public attention. The opening minutes moved smoothly. One of the co-hosts began by referencing Depp's long career, talking about how audiences have grown up watching him on screen and how his work has spanned decades and genres. Depp responded thoughtfully, speaking in a measured pace, acknowledging the support he's felt from fans and emphasizing his continued focus on the craft rather than the noise surrounding it. The panel listened attentively, occasionally interjecting with short affirmations or light follow-up questions. Joy Behar, seated a few spots down the table, nodded along, occasionally glancing toward him but largely letting the conversation flow. As is typical for this kind of show, the discussion gradually widened beyond film projects and into broader topics. One host asked about navigating fame in an era where public opinion forms quickly and loudly, especially on social media. Depp took a moment before answering, pausing just long enough for the studio to quiet. He spoke about how public narratives can take on lives of their own, and how difficult it can be to feel understood when people only see headlines rather than nuance. His voice remained even, but viewers could sense that this was a subject he had clearly spent time thinking about. It was at this point that Joy Behar leaned slightly forward, signaling she was about to jump in. Her tone, when she spoke, was calm but more pointed than what had come before. She acknowledged Depp's feelings about public narratives, then gently pivoted the conversation toward responsibility and accountability, especially for public figures. She noted that while fame can amplify misunderstandings, it can also shield people from criticism, and that audiences often feel invested because celebrities wield influence whether they intend to or not. Depp listened without interrupting, his hands loosely folded on the table. When Joy finished her thought, there was a brief pause, one of those small silences that feels longer on live television than it actually is. Another co-host glanced between them, perhaps sensing a shift in tone. Depp responded carefully, saying that accountability matters, but that accountability should be rooted in facts and fairness, not assumptions. He emphasized that being a public figure doesn't mean forfeiting the right to be seen as a whole person. The exchange remained polite, but viewers could feel the tension beginning to build. Joy responded again, clarifying that she wasn't making accusations, but rather speaking to a larger cultural issue. She mentioned how daytime talk shows like theirs often serve as spaces where these conversations play out because they reflect what viewers are already debating at home. Her body language stayed relaxed, but her words were firm, and she maintained eye contact with Depp as she spoke. Around the table, the other hosts began to subtly adjust. One shifted in her chair, another tapped her pen lightly against her notes. These small movements didn't interrupt the conversation, but they added to the sense that the segment was no longer following a predictable path. The studio audience remained quiet, attentive, with only occasional murmurs of agreement or surprise when a point landed particularly strongly. Depp replied by acknowledging the value of discussion, but he pushed back on what he described as oversimplification. He explained that complex situations often get reduced to sound bites, especially in the media, and that this reduction can distort reality. His tone stayed calm, but his posture straightened, and he began using his hands more as he spoke, emphasizing certain words with small, deliberate gestures. Joy, in turn, pointed out that media platforms also have a responsibility to ask difficult questions, even when they're uncomfortable. She referenced the role of journalists and commentators in representing public concern, not just celebrity perspectives. At this point, the exchange felt less like an interview and more like a live debate, still respectful, but clearly charged. One of the co-hosts attempted to soften the moment by stepping in, suggesting that the conversation highlighted how challenging it is to balance empathy with critique. She smiled toward both Depp and Joy, hoping to redirect the tone. For a moment, it worked. Depp nodded, agreeing that balance is important, and Joy offered a brief smile in response. The audience let out a small, relieved chuckle, but the underlying disagreement hadn't fully dissipated. Joy added one more comment, emphasizing that audiences, especially women who watch the show daily, often look to these conversations to make sense of broader cultural dynamics. She stressed that questioning powerful figures isn't about hostility, but about accountability. Depp's response was measured but firm. He said he welcomed questions, but hoped they would always be grounded in individual truth rather than collective assumption. By the time the show cut to a commercial break, the energy in the room had shifted noticeably from the light, promotional tone of the opening. The hosts thanked Depp and teased that the conversation would continue after the break. As the cameras pulled back, viewers could see Joy adjusting her papers and Depp taking a slow breath, his expression neutral but focused. At home, audiences watching live would have sensed that something real had unfolded, not a rehearsed clash, but an authentic moment where perspectives didn't neatly align. It wasn't explosive or loud, but it was undeniably tense, and it set the stage for what would follow when the show returned. When the show returned from the commercial break, the transition music faded out and the camera came back to the full panel, the energy in the studio noticeably more restrained than before. The hosts were smiling, as they always are when the red light comes back on, but there was a subtle seriousness underneath that viewers who watch these shows regularly would immediately recognize. This was no longer just a friendly celebrity chat. It had shifted into one of those conversations that feels unscripted, where everyone at the table is aware that each word carries a little more weight. The moderator picked things back up by briefly summarizing where the conversation had left off, a common technique on live television to reorient viewers who may have just tuned back in. She framed it as a discussion about public perception, accountability, and how those ideas intersect with fame. Her voice was even, careful not to escalate anything, and she deliberately included both Johnny Depp's and Joy Behar's points without favoring either side. Depp nodded as she spoke, acknowledging the summary. Joy also nodded, though she remained leaning slightly forward in her chair, hands resting near her notes. The body language between the two was polite but alert, the way it often is when a disagreement hasn't been resolved but both parties are committed to keeping things respectful on air. One of the co-hosts turned to Depp and asked a follow-up that felt designed to broaden the lens rather than sharpen the focus. She asked how he personally decides when to speak publicly and when to stay silent, especially during moments of controversy. Depp took a breath before answering. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, explaining that he's learned over time that silence can sometimes be misinterpreted, but speaking too quickly can also fuel misunderstanding. He described it as a difficult balance, especially when narratives move faster than facts. As he spoke, the camera occasionally cut to Joy, who listened intently, her expression neutral but engaged. She wasn't interrupting, but it was clear she had thoughts she wanted to add. The studio audience remained quiet, attentive, with a few heads nodding along as Depp spoke about the emotional toll of constant public judgment. When Depp finished, Joy interjected, thanking him for answering directly before offering her perspective. She said she understood the instinct to protect oneself, but she also emphasized that public silence can leave room for speculation, which often affects more than just the celebrity involved. She mentioned that viewers, particularly those who have experienced being unheard, sometimes project their own frustrations onto public figures who don't address issues head-on. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firm. She wasn't speaking about Depp alone. She was speaking about a broader pattern she'd observed over years in media. Still, the implication was clear enough that the moment carried tension. Depp's posture stiffened slightly, and he looked down at the table briefly before responding. He said he respected that viewpoint but pushed back on the idea that individuals owe constant explanations to the public. He stressed that accountability doesn't have to mean perpetual exposure, and that there's a difference between addressing concerns and being compelled to relive personal experiences for public consumption. His voice remained steady, but viewers could hear the seriousness behind it. At this point, another co-host stepped in, acknowledging both sides and noting how difficult these conversations are precisely because they involve lived experiences and emotions, not just abstract ideas. She reminded the audience that daytime talk shows often function as mirrors for society, reflecting disagreements that exist beyond the studio walls. Her comment seemed intended to validate the exchange without taking sides. The camera briefly cut to the audience, where a few people nodded, some whispered to neighbors, and others sat with arms crossed, clearly thinking through what they were hearing. There was no applause, no audible reaction, just that quiet attentiveness that signals people are processing something in real time. Joy then returned to the conversation, this time focusing on the role of the media itself. She acknowledged that shows like theirs walk a fine line between conversation and confrontation. She admitted that sometimes questions come across sharper than intended, especially when time is limited and topics are complex. It was a subtle moment of self-awareness that softened the tone slightly. Depp responded by appreciating that acknowledgement. He said he understood the format and the pressures of live television, and he made a point of saying he didn't feel attacked in that moment. Still, he reiterated that conversations about accountability should leave room for nuance. He spoke about how easily people can be reduced to symbols rather than seen as individuals, especially when their lives are already heavily scrutinized. The exchange at this point felt less like a disagreement and more like a negotiation of perspectives. Neither Joy nor Depp raised their voices, but both were clearly standing their ground. The hosts around them listened closely, occasionally offering brief affirmations like, "That's fair," or "I see what you're saying," without derailing the discussion. One co-host asked Joy directly how she approaches these conversations when interviewing guests who have been through public controversy. Joy answered candidly, saying her goal is never to corner someone, but to ask the questions she knows viewers are asking at home. She explained that her role isn't just to make guests comfortable, but to represent the audience's curiosity and concerns. Depp nodded slowly as she spoke, acknowledging her role even if he didn't fully agree with every aspect of it. He said that he values honest dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable, as long as it's rooted in respect. That comment seemed to resonate in the studio, drawing a small ripple of murmured agreement from the audience. As the segment progressed, the moderator gently reminded everyone of the limited time remaining, a subtle cue that the conversation would need to move toward some kind of closure. She thanked Depp for engaging so openly and acknowledged Joy for raising important points. Her tone was warm, signaling an effort to land the plane smoothly. Still, before wrapping up, Joy offered one final thought. She said that moments like this, while tense, are actually what daytime television is meant for. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect, and that viewers benefit from seeing people with different perspectives talk things through without shouting or shutting down. Depp agreed, saying that while these conversations aren't always easy, they're necessary. He thanked the panel for allowing space for nuance and said he hoped viewers watching understood that complexity doesn't fit neatly into headlines. As the segment drew to a close, the moderator thanked Depp again and pivoted to the next topic, as live television often does, moving forward even when the emotional residue of a conversation lingers. The audience applauded, not loudly or exuberantly, but with a steady, respectful clap that reflected the tone of what they had just witnessed. For viewers at home, it was clear they had just seen something unscripted and real. Not a viral shouting match, not a sensational confrontation, but a genuine on-air disagreement handled within the boundaries of daytime television. And while the cameras moved on, the conversation itself was far from over, both in the studio and beyond. As the show moved forward, the immediate focus shifted to the next scheduled segment, but for anyone watching closely, The earlier exchange between Johnny Depp and Joy Behar lingered in the background. Even as the hosts introduced a lighter topic, the energy at the table hadn't fully reset. That's one of the realities of live daytime television. Conversations don't always exist in neat, isolated boxes. When something substantive happens, it carries through, subtly shaping everything that follows. During the next few minutes, the camera alternated between the panel and the guest, and viewers could see small but telling changes in body language. Depp remained engaged, answering questions when prompted, but he spoke less freely than at the start of the show. He leaned back slightly more often, folding his hands in his lap rather than resting them openly on the table. Joy, meanwhile, maintained her usual on-air composure, contributing to the conversation as she normally would, but she glanced toward Depp occasionally, as if checking the temperature of the room. One of the co-hosts attempted to inject a bit of levity, referencing a past film role and asking Depp about a behind-the-scenes anecdote. He smiled politely and offered a brief story, drawing a soft laugh from the audience. The moment worked, but only partially. The laughter was lighter than it might have been earlier in the show, and it faded quickly. The studio audience, like the hosts, seemed aware that the tone had shifted, and they adjusted accordingly. As the segment progressed, the moderator subtly guided the discussion back toward themes that connected to what had already been said, but in a less direct way. She asked Depp about how he hopes audiences interpret his work now, especially after such an intense period of public scrutiny. The question was framed carefully, neutral enough to avoid reopening the disagreement, but still rooted in the broader context of the conversation. Depp responded thoughtfully, saying that he hopes people engage with his work on its own terms, separate from whatever narratives might be circulating at the moment. He spoke about storytelling as a way to connect with people across different experiences, and he emphasized that art can sometimes offer clarity where public discourse cannot. His voice was calm, but there was a reflective quality to it that suggested the earlier exchange was still very much on his mind. Joy listened, nodding occasionally. When she spoke next, she didn't challenge him directly. Instead, she built on what he'd said, agreeing that art has the power to bridge divides, but also noting that artists don't create in a vacuum. She mentioned that audiences often bring their own histories and expectations into their relationship with public figures, which can complicate how work is received. This time, Depp responded with a simple acknowledgement, saying he understood that perspective. There was no pushback, no attempt to relitigate the earlier points. It felt like both were consciously choosing to de-escalate, to let the disagreement exist without continuing to press it on live television. Around the table, the other hosts seemed relieved. One smiled more broadly, another leaned in with a follow-up that steered the conversation toward upcoming projects. The rhythm of the show slowly returned to something closer to its usual pace, though it never fully regained the lightness of the opening minutes. The studio audience mirrored this shift. There were more audible reactions again, small laughs, a few scattered claps when a comment landed well. But there was also a sense of attentiveness that hadn't been there before, as if viewers in the room were listening more carefully, aware that they were watching a real-time negotiation of ideas, not just entertainment. As the final minutes of the episode approached, the moderator began wrapping things up. She thanked Depp for spending the morning with them and acknowledged that the conversation had covered a wide range of topics. She framed it as an example of why the show exists, to explore different viewpoints in a way that reflects the complexity of the real world. Joy added a closing remark, turning slightly toward Depp as she spoke. She thanked him for being willing to engage in a conversation that wasn't entirely comfortable, noting that not every guest is open to that. Her tone was sincere, and there was no trace of sarcasm or defensiveness. It was a gesture of professional respect. Depp returned the sentiment, thanking the panel for having him and for allowing space for discussion. He said he appreciated the opportunity to speak directly rather than through headlines or commentary. His expression softened as he spoke, and for the first time since the disagreement, he smiled more naturally. The audience applauded as the show went to its closing credits, the applause steady and genuine. As the cameras pulled back, viewers could see the hosts exchanging brief words with Depp, leaning in slightly, smiling politely. Nothing suggested lingering hostility. If anything, it looked like the kind of respectful cool down that often happens after a meaningful but tense conversation. Once the episode ended, the moment didn't disappear. Clips of the exchange began circulating almost immediately online, shared by viewers who had watched live and by those who caught it later. Social media posts dissected the conversation, some praising Joy for asking difficult questions, others commending Depp for staying composed. Many viewers noted how unusual it felt to see a disagreement unfold without shouting or theatrics. Media commentators weighed in as well, describing the exchange as a reminder of what daytime talk shows can do at their best. Rather than framing it as a clash or a meltdown, many highlighted the restraint shown by both parties. They pointed out that the tension came not from personal attacks, but from fundamentally different views on public responsibility and personal boundaries. Behind the scenes, according to later comments from the hosts, there was no fallout. In subsequent episodes, Joy referenced the conversation briefly, saying she appreciated guests who are willing to engage honestly, even when perspectives don't align. She emphasized that disagreement is not the same as disrespect, a point she returned to more than once in the days that followed. Depp, for his part, didn't address the moment directly in interviews afterward, but he did speak broadly about valuing conversations that allow for complexity. Fans interpreted that as a subtle acknowledgement of what had happened, though nothing was ever explicitly confirmed. For viewers, the lasting impression wasn't one of drama, but of authenticity. The exchange felt unscripted because it was. It reflected the reality of live television, where conversations don't always go according to plan, and where differing viewpoints can surface despite everyone's best efforts to keep things smooth. In the larger context of daytime talk shows, moments like this stand out precisely because they're rare. The format often prioritizes warmth and consensus, but occasionally, genuine disagreement breaks through. When handled carefully, as it was here, those moments can resonate more deeply than any rehearsed segment. And as the conversation continued to ripple outward, it became clear that what viewers had witnessed wasn't a confrontation designed for headlines, but a real-time exchange that mirrored the kinds of discussions happening in living rooms across the country. It was a reminder that even within the polished world of television, unscripted honesty still has a place. In the days following the episode, the conversation that began at the table continued to evolve, both on and off the air. For regular viewers of the show, there was a noticeable shift in how the hosts referenced that morning's discussion, even when they weren't naming it outright. It's common in daytime television for moments like these to ripple subtly through subsequent episodes, influencing tone and topic selection without becoming the sole focus. During the very next broadcast, the panel opened with a discussion about public discourse and how conversations have changed in the age of social media. While no one mentioned Johnny Depp by name, the parallels were clear. Joy Behar spoke about how quickly disagreements can be mischaracterized once they leave the context of live television. She noted that clips circulating online often remove nuance, leaving viewers with a flattened version of what actually happened. Her tone was reflective rather than defensive, and the other hosts nodded along, clearly aware of the timing. One co-host added that viewers sometimes expect talk shows to produce clear winners and losers in debates, when in reality, many conversations are unresolved by nature. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't always come with a neat conclusion, and that sitting with discomfort can be part of the process. For audiences who had watched the Depp episode, the message felt like a continuation of that earlier moment. Joy expanded on that idea, saying that she's always believed the table should be a place where differing opinions can coexist. She acknowledged that as a longtime host, she's had countless conversations that didn't end in agreement, and that's part of the job. She reiterated that asking challenging questions doesn't mean a lack of respect, but rather a belief that viewers deserve honest discussion. Behind the scenes, sources familiar with the show later described the atmosphere after the Depp episode as calm and professional. There were no emergency meetings or apologies issued. The hosts and producers reportedly viewed the exchange as a natural outcome of an unscripted format. That perspective is consistent with how the show has historically handled tense moments, choosing to contextualize rather than escalate. From Depp's side, there was no public statement addressing the exchange directly. However, in a later interview unrelated to the show, he spoke generally about media appearances and how they can sometimes veer into unexpected territory. He described live television as a space where conversations unfold in real time, without the safety net of editing. While he didn't mention the show or Joy Behar, many viewers connected the dots, interpreting his comments as a thoughtful acknowledgement of the experience. Online, viewer reactions continued to accumulate. Some fans praised Depp for remaining composed and articulate, pointing out that he didn't raise his voice or dismiss opposing viewpoints. Others applauded Joy for doing what they saw as her role, representing the questions and concerns of a diverse audience. There were also viewers who felt uncomfortable with the tension, expressing a preference for lighter, more escapist segments. That range of responses reflected the broad audience the show reaches every day. Media analysts weighed in as well, noting that the exchange stood out precisely because it avoided extremes. In an era where televised confrontations often rely on volume and spectacle, this moment unfolded quietly, driven by ideas rather than emotion. Commentators described it as an example of how disagreement can exist within the boundaries of civility, even when the subject matter is personal. As clips continued circulating, producers made a conscious choice not to amplify the moment with promotional teasers or dramatic framing. The show's official social media accounts shared standard highlights from the episode, but they didn't single out the disagreement as a must-see clash. That decision reinforced the sense that the exchange wasn't intended to be a defining moment, but rather part of a broader, ongoing conversation. For longtime viewers, this approach felt consistent with the show's identity. Over the years, there have been many instances where panelists and guests have disagreed on air. Some became talking points for weeks, while others quietly faded into the background. The difference often lies in how the moment is handled afterward. In this case, the restraint shown by both the hosts and the production team contributed to a measured aftermath. Joy Behar, in particular, addressed the idea of on-air disagreement during a later segment focused on communication. She spoke about how important it is to listen as much as speak, especially when conversations touch on lived experiences and deeply held beliefs. She acknowledged that even with good intentions, questions can land differently than expected. Her comments were general, but viewers familiar with the recent episode understood the subtext. The other hosts echoed similar sentiments, emphasizing empathy and curiosity as guiding principles for discussion. One pointed out that guests who are willing to stay at the table during uncomfortable moments often leave a stronger impression than those who avoid difficult topics altogether. That observation resonated with many viewers, reinforcing the idea that the Depp exchange, while tense, demonstrated mutual engagement rather than withdrawal. In the broader media landscape, the moment became part of a larger conversation about how celebrities navigate public accountability. Articles and opinion pieces reference the exchange as an example of the evolving expectations placed on public figures. Some argued that Depp's insistence on nuance reflected a growing pushback against simplified narratives. Others maintained that Joy's line of questioning highlighted the responsibility of platforms to challenge power. Importantly, the discussion rarely descended into personal attacks on either party. While social media, as always, had its more extreme corners, much of the commentary remained focused on ideas rather than individuals. That in itself was notable, suggesting that the tone set on the show influenced how audiences engaged afterward. For the studio audience members who were present that day, later interviews revealed that the moment felt different in person than it might have appeared on screen. Several attendees described the atmosphere as attentive rather than hostile. They noted that the silence during the exchange wasn't uncomfortable, but thoughtful. One audience member said it felt like watching a conversation unfold rather than a performance. That distinction matters in understanding why the exchange resonated. Live television has a way of flattening subtlety, but in this case, the lack of dramatic cues allowed viewers to project their own interpretations. Some saw it as a necessary confrontation, others as a respectful disagreement, and some simply as an example of how difficult these conversations can be. As weeks passed, the moment gradually receded from daily conversation, replaced by new topics and new episodes. Yet it remained part of the show's ongoing narrative, referenced indirectly whenever discussions turned to accountability, media responsibility, or the challenges of public life. For Depp, the appearance became one of many interviews in a long career, but one that stood out because it didn't follow a predictable script. For Joy Behar, it reinforced her role as a host unafraid to ask difficult questions, even when the answers aren't tidy. And for viewers, it offered a reminder of what live daytime television can be at its most genuine. Not a place where everyone agrees, and not a stage for manufactured drama, but a space where real conversations unfold, complete with pauses, tension, and moments of mutual understanding. As the conversation continued to fade from the daily news cycle, the way the segment officially ended that morning became clearer in hindsight. On air, the close was understated, almost deliberately so. There was no attempt to summarize the disagreement in dramatic terms, no lingering camera shots meant to signal conflict. The moderator thanked Johnny Depp once more for joining the show, wished him well with his upcoming work, and smoothly transitioned into the final housekeeping notes of the episode. The credits rolled as the panel exchanged polite smiles and brief off-mic comments, the kind viewers are accustomed to seeing as the music swells and the broadcast wraps. Inside the studio, the audience response at the end was calm and respectful. People stood as the credits rolled, some clapping a bit longer than usual, others gathering their things quietly. There was no sense of awkwardness or unresolved tension in the room, just the subdued energy that follows a serious conversation. Several audience members later described it as thoughtful rather than uncomfortable, noting that it felt like they had witnessed something genuine rather than staged. Once the episode aired nationally, viewer reaction began almost immediately. Social media platforms filled with clips, not because the moment was explosive, but because it felt authentic. Viewers shared short excerpts of the exchange, often accompanied by captions emphasizing how rare it is to see a disagreement handled without raised voices or interruptions spiraling out of control. Many comments focused on the calm tone of the conversation, pointing out that the tension came from ideas rather than personalities. Some viewers sided strongly with Depp, praising him for maintaining composure and articulating his perspective without defensiveness. Others aligned with Joy Behar, saying they appreciated her willingness to voice questions they felt were often left unasked in celebrity interviews. A significant portion of the audience expressed appreciation for both, noting that the exchange demonstrated how two people can disagree publicly without resorting to personal attacks. In the days following, the show addressed the broader themes indirectly. During a later episode, the panel discussed how audiences respond to disagreement on television, acknowledging that viewers often project their own experiences onto what they see at the table. While Depp's name wasn't mentioned, the timing made it clear that the conversation was informed by the recent episode. The hosts emphasized that their goal is not to resolve every issue on air, but to reflect the kinds of discussions people are already having in their own lives. Joy Behar, in particular, revisited the idea of respectful disagreement during a segment about communication styles. She talked about the importance of listening fully before responding, especially when conversations involve personal history or public accountability. Her comments were framed broadly, but many viewers interpreted them as a thoughtful reflection on the exchange rather than a defense of it. From Johnny Depp's side, there was no public follow-up specific to the show. However, in subsequent appearances elsewhere, he continued to speak about the importance of nuance and direct conversation, themes that echoed what he had said at the table. Fans noted the consistency in his messaging, suggesting that the on-air disagreement hadn't altered his approach, but rather reinforced his perspective. Media outlets that covered the moment tended to do so in a measured way. Headlines avoided sensational language, instead describing the exchange as a tense but respectful discussion. Analysts pointed out that the lack of spectacle was precisely what made it noteworthy. In a media environment often driven by extremes, the restraint shown by both participants stood out. As time passed, the segment became one of those moments that longtime viewers reference when talking about the show's ability to host real conversations. It wasn't remembered as a confrontation that derailed the episode, but as a reminder that live television can still produce unscripted, meaningful dialogue. The disagreement didn't define either participant, but it did add another layer to how audiences understood them. For the show itself, the episode reinforced its identity as a space where differing viewpoints can coexist. The producers didn't shy away from the moment, but they also didn't exploit it. By allowing the conversation to stand on its own, they trusted viewers to draw their own conclusions. In the end, what made the exchange resonate wasn't what was said as much as how it was handled. There was tension, but also restraint. Disagreement, but also respect. It mirrored the kinds of conversations many viewers navigate in their own lives, where issues are complex and resolutions aren't immediate. And that's why the moment continues to be discussed, not as a viral clash, but as an example of what daytime talk shows can offer when they allow conversations to unfold naturally. If you watched that episode, or if you've seen the clips and formed your own opinion, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories that break down what really happens when the table gets a little tense.